to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, meeting number 11 for Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. So you're all in the right place. It's great to see folks. If you weren't here when I was just being excited to be back in the room with y'all. I know it's been some time, and we are going to create some space to really reflect back as we start today introducing some material and discussions that we haven't had before. So just before we get started, just some reminders and housekeeping. I'll ask folks to change your name and affiliation if you'd like to use name, pronouns if you'd like to share affiliation. So in order to do that, if you don't remember, you can hover over your face square, if that's a word, click on the ellipses and scroll down to rename, and you can rename yourself and affiliation. As a reminder, the meeting we do have closed captions made available. So on the bottom of your screen, where is it on mine? You can click on the More button. And then if you scroll up to captions, you might, depending on your Zoom functions, have a CC, which you can also do for closed captioning if that helps your participation. Just as a reminder, the meeting is live stream. It is being recorded. So just be mindful of that. And then as a reminder for our chat, we have Anita here who will be our chat curator. So you can chat her directly and she can bring anything that you contribute into the room. So before I kind of go into the agenda and remind us of our meeting guidelines, I'll do a quick roll call. So folks can just say aye or here, or some mechanism to get on the record. Alan, I'm going to start with you, Alan Lazo.
Good morning, all. Good to be here.
Good morning. Alan Hines. Anna Molina. I saw you, Anna.
Yes, I'm here.
There you are. Okay. Ann Kelly. Okay. Alexandra Ring. Becky Baxter.
I'm here, thank you.
Thanks, Becky. Benjamin Kurwitz. Brandon Persinger. Brian Rankin. Brock Nation.
Here.
Yep, sorry, Brock, thank you. Kassara Phipps.
Good morning, everyone.
Chantal.
Morning.
Morning, thank you. Corey. Oh, sorry, I know Corey's not going to be here. David Madison. Melissa Gertler. Garrett Pryor. Garrett Stevenson. And Alan Hines, I see you. We've moved through the alphabet already, but I got eyes on you. Welcome. Gloria Sandoval. Jessica Blakely. And then Jevra, I know you're here. I see you. You're alternate for Dana today. Julia Metz. Lindsay Hutchinson.
Morning.
Morning. Lucia, I know you were here somewhere. Lucia.
Morning.
Morning. Matt Cunningham.
Hi, everyone. Good morning.
Morning. Mary Kyle.
Hi.
Hi, welcome. Megan Bolton.
Hello.
Morning. Mercedes. Let's see, Mercedes. Miranda. Patricia Stiefendorfer.
Good morning, everyone. Patricia here. Thank you.
Morning. Rachel, Lori Bidu.
Here.
Okay. Morning. Ryan Vandenhoof. Richard Rogers.
Here.
Thank you, Richard. Samantha Bear. Shane, I didn't see Shane. Okay. Shannon Vilhauer.
Here.
Welcome. Ted Reed.
Morning.
Morning. Tara Wilcoxon and Victor Saldana.
Here.
Great, thank you. Did anybody join after we got through the part of the alphabet that I missed?
Hi, yeah, I'm here. I'm Ann Kelly.
Hi, Ann, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else that I missed? Okay. And then our DLCD folks, as they present, they'll refresh you on who they are. So thank you for that. We can bring the slides back up. So just as we move through today, so again, we'll do a little more housekeeping as part of the welcoming and overview of how we're going to spend our day together. But at a high level, our agenda will create some space for really looking back. So some rulemaking, refresher, a space for reflections, really trying to describe kind of the contributions you all have made and how those have currently shaped rules that have been developed. We'll pass it to Anita to just remind us, refresh us on the racial equity framework that we'll always be holding as a lens and filter in which we dialogue around the work. And then we'll be introducing, a robust discussion on housing capacity and urbanization, so to get an update on the work that's been happening and some critical questions that the agency has for RAC members. We will build in a break, provide an update on the work of the Housing Action Work Group, and then we'll get you out of here by noon. So that's how we'll spend our day together. If we go to the next slide. And then I know we haven't been together in a few months, so I'm just going to spend just a little extra time today really thinking about our meeting guidelines. So just as a reminder, and I will say, y'all have been really good about this as we've been together in the past, but I'll just say, part of our opportunity and obligation together to seek and learn from each other, to be respectful, to be candid, and to be constructive, right? Really helping us as a collective move conversations forward. To the extent that you all have differences and are able to discuss and debate and resolve to find common ground, that's incredibly helpful as the agency's looking to you for that advice and guidance. In a group setting, obviously, we will be bringing things into the room, avoiding surprises. There's not a lot of space for isolation conversation online, but again, like to the extent that you all are always bringing things forward as early as possible in the process, it really helps the process overall. We do have an opportunity both in this space and outside of this space. You can always email housing.dlcd@dlcd.oregon.gov. And include either ODA rulemaking RAC, either for DLCD staff only, if you'd like to just give input to staff, or you can label it as for public comment that gets captured in the broader record. And you can see Ellen has put that email in the chat. And then just, folks remember the charter, really asking folks, there's a lot of work that goes into ensuring that the agenda is purposeful. And so really honoring the topics that we've brought forward. We ask that you're kind of stepping in, stepping back, paying attention to how much you're either contributing, or if you're someone who's not contributing, really pushing yourself to come into the space, and we'll provide, multiple ways to contribute. And then, I'll ask that we're addressing issues and questions, not people or organizations, right? So really being, as my colleague says, hard on the issues and soft on the people. And then, don't overuse chat, right? So it's difficult to have a side conversation virtually, but not using chat as a way to have virtual side talk. Any questions about kind of our guidelines? And again, I've appreciated the way you all have engaged with each other. So I'm going to pass it to Ethan to kind of give us a high level hopes for how we use today.
Thank you, Ben. And hi, everyone. My name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I'm the manager of the housing division here at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Today, we are back at the Rulemaking Advisory Committee for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. It's been a whole season since most of you or some of you, and half of a legislative session. So, lots has changed, but we'll spend some time talking through today. Kind of some reflections on the 2024 rulemaking process, try to get folks back on the same page and reorient all of us to where we're at this current moment in this rulemaking process. Provide some updates on the two ongoing phases, or not phases, but the two ongoing buckets of work that are happening in this second phase of rulemaking. And then we'll talk a little bit about where we're going next at the end of this meeting. But if we move into the next slide, I'll start first with some reflections and just a refresher on the 2024 process. This is a graphic that you've seen many times and you'll see many times again today. It's our North Star in terms of helping us try to orient to what the ONA policy is in the broad sense, right? And an important reminder here is that the ONA policy, as it's currently implementing statewide planning goal 10, can kind of be broken down into three major buckets or three major elements. The first is determining housing need through things like a housing production target or an allocation of needed housing into a contextualized housing need. Then from there, local governments take those local actions within their control to respond to that housing need. And finally, throughout the implementation of those actions, the city and the state are tracking and monitoring progress towards their goals and achieving particular outcomes. So just a high level overview as we've seen before. Hopefully that grounds folks kind of back into this process here a little bit more. So we move into the next slide. In terms of the rulemaking work here, the rulemaking as it was set forth in the establishment of HB 2001, the passage of HB 2001 in the 2023 legislative session, there are three major elements of this rulemaking, two of which have already concluded, and we'll talk a little bit about in this first portion of the agenda, and one of which is continuing on, which will be the bulk of our kind of discussion time for today. So the two phases of this work, or the two buckets of work that have concluded at this point in time, are related to needs and production. Also, that work was primarily carried by the Technical Advisory Committee, known as the Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee, NAPTAC, related to what it means to kind of implement the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. What does it mean to plan for needed housing? How do you integrate principles of affirmatively furthering fair housing into the Goal 10 planning framework? And the second one was related to the acceleration program, so the HOTAC scope of work. This was about measuring underperformance. What does it mean for local government to identify and overcome those barriers to housing production? And then how does the state provide tools and incentives to help local governments kind of overcome barriers that still exist in that program? And the third phase, which we'll talk again, will be a good chunk of the agenda today, is related to capacity and urbanization. When we're kind of doing housing planning, what does that also mean for planning for urbanization, planning for a 20-year planning horizon, city growth, and land use efficiency measures? Next slide, please. So a little bit of a refresher again on that 2024 adoption. Like we mentioned, there's in the needs and production and the housing accountability kind of scope of work, that rulemaking in 2024 really focused on these primary areas, which are the contextualized housing need, implementing some refinements to and extensions and refreshing the housing production strategy program, and then establishing the housing acceleration program. Next slide. So we figured it would be kind of useful here to overview those three pieces on kind of what the intended approach for each of these items are, and what is the output of that particular segment of this work, to kind of get a sense of how this is building across that entire spectrum of that diagram that we continuously show. So a contextualized housing need that is codified in the Chapter 660, Division 8, Section 75 of the rules that were adopted by the Land Conservation Development Commission last year. And the contextualized housing need is really that kind of first assessment, that chapter 1 of a city's housing planning work. What does it mean to actually identify and determine a local government's housing need in the context of their own local government? So these kind of things are both the numbers, right? The needed housing allocation and the housing production target from the state that are then brought down to the local government level and built upon through additional analysis that only the local government can really do. Things like affordability analyses, things like assessment of past discriminatory actions, and an analysis of fair housing choice in that local government, so that a local government is building towards a better understanding of their needed housing types, characteristics, and locations of housing within their community. And kind of the end of that contextualized housing need kind of leads that local government. The yield of that contextualized housing need is that it is kind of that stepping stone, that launching off point from which local governments will do all of their kind of housing planning based off of. So they would conduct a housing production strategy around the results of that contextualized housing need assessment. They will also take actions in their housing capacity analysis based on the findings in their contextualized housing need. We go to the next slide, talk a little bit about the conversations that we had with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee on the rule development related to contextualized housing needs. So kind of orient you all to these slides. On the left, in the left column, you'll see some of the comments, a summary of the comments that we heard from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee on this particular section of rules. And then on the right-hand column, you'll see how those comments were implemented or considered in the actual adoption of the rules. So I won't necessarily go through each and every one of these, but you'll have an opportunity to kind of take a look and see, where your comments were addressed and how they were considered in the rulemaking. But as it relates to the contextualized housing need, the primary concerns were about, well, how much work is this going to take at the local government, and can we actually make good on the obligations that we as a local government have to contextualize our housing need in the manner that's described in administrative rule. Some of those concerns were related to the data availability for local governments to actually do this analysis, particularly as it relates to some of the requirements around past discriminatory actions. And so how that kind of shaped the rules is that a recognition of, while some of that work, some of that data is not readily available or standardized across the state, and some local governments have more information available to them to make this assessment, that they can use the data that is available to the local government and is actually able to be incorporated into that analysis. However, the state would also seek to create additional kind of data resources for local governments because of the importance of that work. So you'll see that kind of reflected in the rules that were adopted by Commission, particularly as it relates to some of the questions around housing types, locations, and income ranges. The contextualized housing need is really important to kind of set up the process that a local government is planning for a future that is not necessarily exactly like the past. And an important element of that is to, in the rules, actually be specific and retain some of those elements of that kind of fair housing approach to planning for housing in the goal tent framework, particularly as it's related to the kind of assessment that local governments are making and the future that they're planning towards around fair housing and particularly fair housing choice. And so the rules kind of emphasize and keep the elements of that of those key elements that even existed prior to the ONA framework. And then a real specific piece here related to appealability of a contextualized housing need, right? What we know is in a housing capacity analysis, because that is a land use decision that local governments eventually make, that leaves the fundamental basis for that housing capacity analysis up for potential appeal through the typical land use decision process. And so that really is unavoidable in kind of a rulemaking instance. And so to kind of mitigate against some of that, the rules consider or open the door for a local government to kind of go through this segmented adoption approach, particularly as it relates to the contextualized housing need, so that in an instance where a local government is saying, well, we really want to clear that first hurdle of identifying our housing need, get some assurance that that is acceptable and we can move forward with the rest of our planning with that kind of assurance that our contextualized housing need is meeting the mark for the purposes of these planning exercises, and we can kind of bank on that and move forward in this process with some certainty. All right, if we move into the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the refinements to the housing production strategy. The housing production strategy, what we know is a game plan of actions that the local government is planning to take to meet their housing needs and their identified housing needs that were identified in their contextualized housing need. The important part of the housing production strategy is that it is responsive to that contextualized housing need, that the needs that are identified in the contextualized housing need are directly, there's a line connecting the actions that the local government is proposing to take with that back to that contextualized housing need. So the actions are inherently and directly tied to the needs identified. Those actions also need to have timelines and steps in the process, and also the ability to be, tracked and measured over time. And then finally, in making the determination of which actions a local government is going to actually take, and the mitigating measures that the city might employ to ensure that those actions are not causing undue burden to particular populations, particular communities of color, low-income populations, people with disabilities, and tribal communities. There's an analysis of benefits and burdens that are required for each of those actions in the housing production strategy. So housing production strategy, what is the output of that? It's a game plan. It's an action plan that is a comprehensive look at the needs that the local government has and the actions that they're going to take in direct response to that need. And the cities are identifying the steps that they're going to take in the short term, 6 or 8 year term, to actually achieve and meet their housing needs, or at least remove the barriers to that housing need. We move into the next slide. We'll talk a little bit, again, it's kind of same formation of these slides. What was the commentary that we heard from Rulemaking Advisory Committee members and others, and how is that reflected in the rules? First one is related to that benefits and burdens analysis. In housing production strategies that we've received so far, that analysis is sometimes missing from this process, and it does feel like it's an important element of the housing production strategy to make that consideration of those benefits and burdens if we are truly making a determination of the actions that are going to be most responsive to the need. We need to do that assessment of burdens and benefits and burdens to those populations in particular, and so you'll see that definitely reflected and emphasized in the adopted rules from 2024. There's also, I think, a general concern about local government implementation of those actions, in the of flexibility that local governments might maintain in their actual action adoption throughout time. If there are instances where the housing production strategy actions that have been identified are either not able to be implemented, or circumstances change, or anything like that, how does a local government go through that process while also being able, on the other side, the agency and the department and any others following along, being able to ensure that those commitments that local governments are making to identifying the needs and addressing the needs are actually being followed through on. And so the housing production strategy rules kind of address this in allowing the kind of alternative action development happen at the same time as a primary action. So in an instance where local government is saying, we're heading towards the path of this particular action, but we also want to ensure that we're able to kind of pivot if we get to a point and make, through our analysis, or deciding to go a different route, that we can do that. And that those kind of two things can happen in parallel, and the local government has the ability to kind of pivot and adapt at that point in time. And then I think a really important conversation took place in the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and the Technical Advisory Committee process related to exploratory work. If the expectation and the requirement of a housing production strategy action is that it's committal in nature, is committing the city to take this action to address its need, what does it mean for a local government to also need to do those kind of actions that are exploratory in nature, a study of sorts that would then lead to the next step, the actual committal action? And so the rules kind of distinguish between those exploratory work and actually the committal actions. And it's a really important piece of the program, particularly when the department is reviewing those actions and making approval decisions. And then finally, around engagement, local governments, or not even local governments, I think folks were generally concerned about the level of engagement that was expected and required, and then the fatigue that might cause on our communities who we are asking for their feedback on. And so the rules intend to fit nicely into the engagement program that the local government has already been doing for other housing related work, or even non-housing related work, and kind of emphasize or allow local governments and encourage local governments to use those topically relevant and recent community engagement efforts to inform their housing production strategy.
Ethan,
Yes.
I just heard that recording stopped.
Yes.
Can we double check that, just so we don't lose the content that you're sharing? Ingrid, do you know if I can't tell.
We've got some direct messages because of the Zoom chat set up for this meeting, and it looks like Ingrid is having computer trouble and needs to leave. So I think, Ben, you just became the host.
Okay.
Ethan, I'm not sure if you know what that might mean for our recording.
I mean, I can record it, right? I mean, let's see what happens.
Yeah.
I can
I
share
think
the,
we're also
yeah.
I think
jump in.
we're also live streaming, so there is a record of it.
Yeah, this is Casaria. Ingrid just called me. She's having some computer problems. She needs to reboot. Yes, it is being recorded on YouTube, and that is still running. So you will have one full recording, at least through YouTube.
Okay, great. Thank you. I wanted to make sure we were staying in our compliance lane. All right, Ethan, back to you. Thanks.
That's good. All right, into the next slide, the final refresher here, which is the Housing Acceleration Program. So, and if we remember that diagram from the beginning of the meeting, and that's kind of the far right side of that diagram about tracking and monitoring. This is a new element of the Goal 10 planning process under HB 2001 from 2023 in the ONA work. And this is kind of codified in the 300 section of Division 8. There are 4 steps to this acceleration program. And it is built on the premise that at a at a point in time in the cycle of the Goal 10 planning process, a local government will be eligible for consideration of the progress that they're making towards their housing production target and the implementation of their local actions. And at that time, the department will make a determination whether or not to refer eligible local governments into the Housing Acceleration Program, which then leads to a state audit of, in partnership with the local government, an audit of the barriers that still exist in local government, even in lieu of actions taken. And from there, based on the findings of that audit, an acceleration agreement that is an agreement, kind of an action plan to course correct based on the actions that the city has taken and the barriers that are present or found in that state audit. And then the hope is that that's where the process stops, and the local government and the state are kind of happy with the completion of the acceleration agreement. But if not, there is a fourth step, which is an enforcement order, which would further compel the local government to take particular actions as identified in the acceleration agreement and through the audit. And so the kind of output or the outcome of the housing acceleration program is that the audit, right? Identification of the barriers that the local government is experiencing, particularly around housing production, affordability, and choice. And then also the partnership, right? We can identify the barriers, but also the important part is getting across the finish line and actually addressing those barriers. And so the partnership the partnership and plan to address those barriers is really the kind of key part of this acceleration program. The state can bring additional resources or technical support to the fold that hopefully assist the local government in overcoming those barriers and taking those actions. So we move into the next slide. I think one of the major concerns about the housing acceleration program is just like what this means, right? What is the enforcement? How would the state wield its enforcement authority as it's envisioned under the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Program? And what does it actually mean for a local government to be identified as underperforming in relation to their regional and kind of market peers? And so definitely some, concerns or feedback related to who and when local governments are being compared to their peers. And in the rules, we kind of clarified the process for the comparators and when a local government is kind of being compared against those peers. So that happens at the timeline of a city, in their cycle when they're starting that process, and the peers that they are kind of matched with are kind of following with that jurisdiction throughout that entire process. So it's not kind of this moving target. Welcome back, Ingrid. All right. So in the remainder of the housing acceleration program, the question that we always get often is about how can we structure the housing acceleration program such that a local government is really held to the actions that are only within their control, right? Cities don't control things like interest rates or the kinds of construction that are, that's happening in residential development that's happening in their jurisdiction to some extent. But if cities are going to be measured against their target, how do we ensure that the local governments are able to adapt over time and address particular barriers to the many magnitudes of housing that are that they're striving to meet over their planning period? And so the rules establish a kind of coordination or a consideration of the underproduction as it's related to very low, and extremely low income levels. When we're kind of talking about an assessment towards their housing production target, those the underproduction in those particular income levels for housing in those particular income levels is of particular importance in the consideration of whether or not a local government is finding themselves in the acceleration program. And then in hearing concern about local government's kind of ability to be flexible in their housing production strategy, action, implementation. We kind of talked about this a little bit already, but the rules in the acceleration program address kind of or establish this formal process of replacement actions, being able to kind of adapt on the fly based on new information at the local government level. That process is formalized in the midpoint review of the housing acceleration or the housing production strategy cycle. So I think I'll stop there in terms of the refresher for those items. But if we move into the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what has happened since. So, or maybe Ben, I don't know, I'm going to go a little bit off script here, but see if there's any questions on any of that like refresher that I provided. That was quite a bit for folks.
Yeah,
So
why don't we
things
pause?
that were confusing. Yeah.
Yeah, why don't we do that? So just want to open it up. Any reflections or clarifying questions based on kind of the look back?
Okay.
I'm not seeing any hands.
Okay. That's fair enough.
Okay, keep going.
All right. So at the adoption hearing of the Land Conservation Development Commission to adopt all of those things that I had just talked about, and also in response to some of the feedback that we heard from you all throughout the course of 2024, is that particularly in relation to a local government's ability to navigate the requirements in the ONA program, things like choosing actions in the housing production strategy, conducting a contextualized housing need, and interfacing with the housing acceleration program. The Land Conservation Development Commission amended the charge of this rulemaking advisory committee to add this fourth bullet. And I apologize, I'm going to read this to you all because I think the words are actually really important. So bear with me here while I kind of read from the screen. The Land Conservation Development Commission added this to the rulemaking charge: develop a clear compliance pathway for local governments through the housing production strategy and housing acceleration programs, utilizing program design tools like safe harbors or minimum standards in furtherance of affirmatively furthering fair housing, increasing housing production affordability and choice, and reliability in program outcomes for local governments. And so what this amendment to the rulemaking charge did, if we go to the next slide, is continue the work of the rulemaking into kind of this current phase, in the 2025 phase of this rulemaking. So we have the existing work that we have already been working on through the Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee, through to kind of identify the ways in which the local governments can use state methodologies and assumptions to estimate things like a buildable lands inventory, and doing that kind of cross goal 10, goal 14 urbanization work. It also added an additional piece to that phase 2 scope, which is the Housing Actions Work Group. This work group is intended to focus on that fourth bullet of the rulemaking charge, and to think through additional resources and compliance pathways for local governments to interact with this kind of ONA planning process. So these are the Housing Actions Work Group, which you'll hear a little bit about today. You'll hear primarily about the urbanization work, but the Housing Actions Work Group is thinking through the development of adoption-ready actions, things like the model codes, or other actions that seek to affirmatively further fair housing. It's also building out the kind of guidance and tools and resources that local governments will have available to them to navigate the programmatic requirements of the Goal 10 planning process as it exists today. So just know that The 2025 rulemaking phase will include both of these scopes of work, and the Rulemaking Advisory Committee from this point on through the rest of 2025 will often hear about both of these elements in this space. So while these things are happening concurrently and at the same time, the Rulemaking Advisory Committee is really a space for us to kind of talk about both of them. So with that, I appreciate the ability to do that 2024 refresher and talk a little bit about where we're going in 2025. So I'll hand this back to you, Ben.
Great, thanks, Ethan. So again, we can pause. I don't know if I call on Commissioner Lazo, if you had anything to add, but did want to create some space and appreciate, Ethan, you really kind of bringing us to this point and then helping to tee up what we'll talk about the rest of our meeting today and moving forward. But, you know, Commissioner Lazo, I don't know if you wanted to add anything, particularly in that, you know, previous slide context.
Yeah, thanks, man. I really appreciate that and appreciate the summarization that Ethan gave. I think the one thing I would add from the dais of LCDC is this sense of kind of flexibility on both ends of this programming, kind of flexibility around the pathways and what they might look like, how they might be shaped, and kind of what form they'll take. But also the flexibility for us to come back later and say we didn't get it right, or we haven't gotten it right yet. Let's make sure that we are iterating through the opportunities to make this program as successful as we can. So, you know, I think those were 2 points in that, particularly after the rules were passed and the addition of the charge, that were really important to the commission from where I sat. So appreciate it, Ethan and Ben. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And let me correct myself, Vice Chair Lazo. So congratulations, and let me get my honorifics correct. So just, you know, before I pass it to Anita, so we've kind of done some of the technical look back. Anita had a chance to meet with some RAC members around more of our process. But before I go there, any other just pause for questions or clarifications? Tara?
Yeah, I have a quick question, if I may. First, I really appreciate that fourth bullet point, which was added to include the additional charge of rulemaking. So thank you for sharing that with us. I also just was wondering if you could clarify whether the Housing Actions Work Group includes the development of the safe harbors or the minimum requirements.
Yes, Tara, great question. So yes, the Housing Actions Work Group is in development of adoption-ready actions, model codes, compliance pathways, and which is short form for things like safe harbors, minimum requirements, and those rebuttable presumptions. Just kind of, I think, a real quick assessment of where that work group is at now is trying to decide which of those tools is the right tool to use, programmatic tool, programmatic design tool to use, but is a core element of that work group's scope of work.
And then Celestina and Theo, you all will be kind of catching folks up on kind of the work of the Housing Actions Work Group later in our agenda. So Tara, if you have other questions around how that's kind of shaping up and the type of conversations that are happening, you know, both they'll cover that and please bring it back into the space. Thanks for the question. Any other questions, comments, reflections? Okay, not seeing any. Anita, I'll pass it to you. So Anita will kind of do some reflection on kind of process reflection from some of her findings, and then also lead us right into the teeing us up for the racial equity framework, kind of a refresher reminder of that work.
Thank you, Ben. Hi,
Yep.
everybody. Nita Kaylani Yap, Multicultural Collaborative. I wanted to thank the folks that I spent some time with interviewing. DLCD and I identified a few RAC members to interview on process. And thank you all for participating as well for that. I put together a short little summary that I'll just kind of talk through with you. As you all know, the rules are pretty technical. And for folks who are not technical experts, in particular folks who are not working for cities and counties that will be implementing it was really complex, but also I have to say DLCD staff got a lot of kudos and support for bringing in kind of diverse voices as well. So those of you that have hung in as RAC members, we really appreciate your voice and how you've engaged with us. So some of the process improvements that were suggested that definitely DLCD is considering, and other processes that have been really helpful. I'll just go simply, go through a short summary of it. I think the RAC hours for office hours were really helpful for those who attended. Also, the RAC buddies for those that have used that. And a reminder, the RAC buddies, there was a DLCD staff assigned to RAC members to like meet up and support them in if they wanted to meet outside the RAC meetings to get more information about some of the information and technical experts, technical information to work through so they could participate. That was really helpful. And I think just again, having the diverse voices and the facilitation in particular, Ben Duncan was called out as really making space for folks. So thank you, Ben, for making that space for folks to really engage. Some of the key recommendations for improvement, one of them was simplify and clarify materials. Those of you who have waded through a lot of the packet material, you know there's a lot of technical information, and folks had suggested shorter technical summaries, outlining decision points, and clarify what the rules can and can't do. I think reminding folks as we move through, especially folks who are working at the local level, people with lived experience, to understand how these rules affect development. I mean, Ethan, you mentioned a lot about kind of what happens at the local level. So I think just a reminder at the meetings, because I think there's a lot of really good information shared at some of the RAC meetings, but those necessarily could not be implemented within the rules. The second one was strengthening communication. You know, there's kind of a big, you all are doing a lot of work between the last full RAC meeting until now. And so I think some folks are interested in maybe some short updates during that period of time on what was going on would have been really helpful. I think also another one related to how feedback was used. And I think, Ethan, you did a really good job in the presentation on some of the RAC comments. So really taking that to heart was really helpful. Enhancing and supporting members with special needs, I think in particular was really important, and we're really committed to helping folks who with special needs, especially things related to a system justice focused support for folks, especially folks with lived experience, structuring the buddy system to be more clearly articulated roles and contact methods. More capacity building opportunities, like legal language interpretation sessions. There's a lot of technical information, and I think folks felt a little intimidated that they needed to understand what the rules meant and what the technical components were. Improving representation and outreach. So, you know, we did have a youth member, and in particular, and a lot of the meetings were held during, school hours, so they weren't able to participate. And then maybe some additional focused outreach, maybe focus groups for folks with lived experience, working with grassroots outreach organizations as well. The next one was meeting design. The Zoom was really great, but I think there was maybe some more opportunity for in-person options for feedback. Accessibility tools were a challenge for some folks, especially like the Miro board. It's like being clear about how that works, and access and providing additional support. And then the last one was creating more focused space, especially separate sessions for advocates or specific groups to dig into relevant issues in smaller, safer environments. I think some folks felt intimidated in the large group to ask questions, especially if they had questions about information in the packet material and there is a lot of technical discussion and trying to get up to speed. So I think overall, though, the feedback that we got was they were really honored to participate. They really appreciated DLCD's intention to include them in this. And I think moving forward, the commitment that you all have made is really appreciated by the folks that I interviewed.
Right. Thanks. So I wonder if we could just pause and just, if there's anything that's resonating with folks, or if folks would want to, certainly if anyone who talked to Anita wanted to lift up and emphasize or kind of shine more light on anything that was said, but just wanted to create a little bit of space in the pause.
Yeah, feel free to speak up, those that I interviewed, and then other folks on the rack, what you're hearing, if there's anything you wanted to reflect on as well as far as your experience up to this point in serving on the rack.
I'm going to capture this as you did a good job representing the reflections that you heard, Anita. So you can keep going. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So, well, we're going to move on to the racial equity framework for decision making. As a reminder, this framework was adopted by the LCDC, the commission, for DLCD staff to address for all rulemakings and projects. And so special thanks to LCDC Vice Chair Alan Lazo on that. And I'm going to walk through this really quickly, and then Vice Chair Lazo, I'd like to give you the opportunity if there's anything you wanted to add in the meantime. But there's 8 kind of buckets that we have here, or 8 categories that rulemaking will have to address, just as a reminder. So this is really great to remind you all on the rec too, as we're going through the remainder of the rulemaking discussion, that any of these we would love to have your feedback on. So some of again, the categories are looking at the historical inequities related to the rulemaking, especially in housing. Ethan mentioned benefits and burdens. Now that's in rule, so there's some discussion opportunities there. Looking at data equity and data justice. So again, reporting and accountability, what does that look like, and what are some opportunities for including data equity and data justice? Community engagement and empowerment, as you see that there's a lot of requirements and opportunities for community engagement and empowerment. So what are some other ways that this RAC committee can help support engagement, equitable engagement, and empowerment through these roles? Accountability, as you can see, there's a lot of requirements and opportunity for accountability through these roles, and some ways to think about that. Restorative justice is the next one. I'm going to just keep moving on. And decision making in particular, I think, who makes the decisions? What are the opportunities for that kind of discussion? And then measuring and evaluating outcomes and continuous improvement. So there's a lot of opportunity again with especially this rulemaking with all of these categories in the framework for decision making. And then I'm going to maybe hand it over to Vice Chair Lazo if there's anything you wanted to add that may have been developments in the interim since we've met last.
I don't know if there have been any further developments. I think one thing I'd say is I just appreciate, thanks Anita and to the DLCD team for continuing to hold these elements of rulemaking throughout the process. And I think I really appreciate what Ethan went through this afternoon or this morning in talking about the responses from DLCD in some of these areas. I think that's really important. And the thing is, I think the other thing we can think about is that these 8 areas don't have to end at rulemaking. As we implement this work throughout the state, I think these are things that we can continue to consider as we're implementing this work. Even though they're built into the rules to some degree, there are certainly opportunities, as Anita said, to further this work in the work on the ground and in the implementation.
Awesome. Thank you. And I know, maybe this is getting a little bit out of order as well, but I know DLCD, aren't you doing some sessions around your community engagement framework? So maybe that's something we can share in the chat. To your point, Vice Chair, how does this work kind of show up in the real world, beyond the rules, and that's one of the mechanisms around engagement strategies. Any questions or reflections based on the racial equity framework. You will see some of these questions built into our discussion today, and the way that we're asking you to think not just through these kind of 8 different kind of categories around the framework, but also just as Anita said, those specifically around benefits and burdens for vulnerable populations. But again, just pausing if there's any comments or thoughts or reflections. Okay, not seeing anyone or any hands up. I'm going to pass it to Karin. Thanks, Anita. And we'll move into housing capacity urbanization.
Thanks, Ben. Good morning. Karen Dijen Chapman. I am with DLCD's urbanization team, and we are working on our capacity and urbanization rules for own rulemaking. I thought I'd give you a quick overview. You all, as a group, have received some updates throughout last year on the work we've been doing with our committee members, and I thought I'd give you a broad overview of how that's fitting in with all the rules that were adopted last year and the work continuing this year. Thanks for that. So capacity and urbanization. Last year, this group, our RAC members, talked a lot about the focus areas of housing production, housing affordability, and housing choice. And what our committee, Capacity and Urbanization, was working on last year was around land supply. A lot of discussions around how we inventory that land, how we estimate the capacity on that land, and how do we ready land and determine land is development ready. So that's a lot of new lingo and a lot of new terms. So I wanted to pause this morning for a moment to just say, we had some discussions with Ben and Anita, and they have given us permission to really break down a lot of these concepts into layman's terms. And I'm pausing because I know there are many of you that sit on this rack that have way more depth and breadth of experience than any of us on producing affordable housing, like the actual construction, the pre-development, all of that phases. There are folks on this rack that have way more depth of experience and maybe breadth on urban growth boundary amendments. Whether that's a UGB exchange, an establishment of an urban reserve, or an expansion. So by no means are we insulting your intelligence, but as many of you know, English is my second language, and I have leaned on my colleagues quite a bit to learn these technical terms, to use them correctly. And I'm going to set some of that aside, and I'm going to break it down with Anita and Ben's permission as if I were trying to explain it to my own children or to my grandmother. So that's what we're going to attempt to do right now. And we can go on to the next slide. So we decided that this was also a pivotal opportunity as we're changing focus in topic areas to get to know you all as RAC members a little bit more in depth on what you're interested in surrounding housing and how land supply relates to that. And I know it seems very obvious that you need some land underneath the housing, but there's some more nuanced policy discussions around how land is regulated, what is permissible. And so at the end of this meeting, we're going to have a little survey, and you guys can choose to do the survey in the typical SurveyMonkey post-RAC. We have some questions to get to know you a little bit better and the content of these subjects. Or we'll have a mirror board up and you can do it right now while you're in the meeting. So I wanted you all to know that we're going to try to get some depth of knowledge on each of you, your interest areas, your priorities around housing, and how we can relate that to the conversations we're going to have around land supply. So the housing capacity analysis is that piece in the Goal 10 housing process where all cities are doing an inventory of their land. It's called the buildable land inventory. And if I had to break that down to explain it to grandma, I would say every lot and parcel is inventoried for, hey, is it vacant? What is allowed on that lot or parcel? That means what is it zoned for? And that zoning comes with a designation of what density is allowed. Hey, are we allowed to put 40 units on there? Oh no, it's only allowed for 2 units. That's the way it's zoned for. The development code and the zoning code will have a lot of criteria on how high it's allowed to go. So it doesn't make sense for let's say, a small town of 3,000 in Sisters on their main street have a 10-story building. So their zoning code and their development standards probably won't allow that for the main street. A town of 3,000 population in Sisters. But it does make sense in Portland, if you're looking at Main Street and maybe 10th Avenue, where you can have some really big height and big massing. So some buildings, some residential buildings might take a whole city block. And so when we look at the land supply and how we inventory that, we estimate the capacity. And what is new in ONA is we have the state provided housing need allocation that's coming out of the Office of Economics, so our Department of Administrative Services. So each city will know what their housing need is through that allocation. They will inventory their land and look at the supply of land within their city boundary, within their urban growth boundary. And then if they have urban reserves, we will hear more and we will talk to you about what those are. And then within ONA, we've introduced a new inventory. So the legislation from House Bill 2001 codified in statute a brand new inventory that cities must complete with their housing production strategy program. So this inventory is for the intention of how do you produce more housing. So it's really focused on the conversations you all had, excuse me, around housing production, housing affordability and choice. And that inventory is a development ready land inventory. So I've got my buildable land. I know it's zoned for certain residential use. It might be zoned for certain densities, or how high can I build? How big can this building be? And now I need to look within that buildable land, what land is really going to develop, that it's ready for development within that housing production cycle timeframe. And that may be 8 years, depending on your city and where you're at, or maybe 6 years, depending on city size or which region you're in. And so these concepts that we're going to bring to you center around inventorying the land, estimating that capacity on the land, and understanding development readiness. And that third one is our newest concept. And with that, our discussions with our TAC members last year started out with, when you inventory your land, there's going to be some constraints on that land. So there are properties that are adjacent to creeks and rivers. There are land that may have some hazards, very steep slopes, and maybe some landslide hazards. And so we worked through some draft rule concepts. Hopefully you all have had a chance to glance over that memo. And that memo was written by Jenna, who led a lot of our TAC conversations around the natural resources and natural hazard constraints within inventorying that land. So that's the overview that I have for you all today on how land supply and capacity of that land fits into the ONA rules. I think now we'll share with you how the discussions on inventorying the buildable land and those constraints have played out at our TAC, how we reflected those conversations in draft rule proposal. And we met with our TAC last week to go over our draft rule language. And we have some takeaways we can share with you all here today in some discussion. All right, so I'll wrap that up. Jenna, if you are ready, we'll cue up your slides.
Thank you. Good morning, Jenna Hughes, Housing and Growth Management Analyst with DLCD and supporting the Capacity and Urbanization TAC, or CowTAC. It's good to see you all again and share more of what we've been working on. Today, we're going to be covering natural resource and hazard constraints and the draft approach for how these are considered inside and outside the urban growth boundary, or UGB. We'll discuss buildable land inventories first and the draft approach, followed by unsuitable land outside the urban growth boundary. And there will also be opportunities to ask questions and provide feedback on these approaches. I'll also note that we discussed this topic with CowTAC last week, so I'll include some snippets of that conversation later on. Next slide. So Cotton mentioned a lot of this, so I won't repeat too much, but this describes a little bit more about how constraints impact housing and urbanization. As mentioned, the housing capacity analysis includes an element called the Buildable Land Inventory, or BLI, which estimates how much land a city can count on for future housing over a 20-year period. And one of the key steps is first excluding or discounting land that is not suitable for housing, such as natural resources and hazards. And this then helps a city determine whether or not there is enough residentially zoned land to meet that housing need. And if not, they'll need to take actions to respond to that deficiency by either making better use of the land already in their boundary or swapping or adding more land. Next slide. So this is the rule language in question and an example of what a BLI can look like. The words in bold here are what we're focusing on today, which is that per the current definition, land is generally considered suitable and available unless it is constrained by hazards, natural resources, slopes greater than 25%, or within the 100-year floodplain. And I'll also note that we're going to be covering public facility constraints in a separate meeting, so just stay tuned for that conversation. And what we're really focusing on per our rulemaking charge is creating clarity and certainty around how cities best estimate and inventory their land. Next slide, please. So these are a couple examples of cities with very different levels of constraints. And you'll see Redmond on the left here has a few pockets of wetlands and steep slopes, but not too much. But on the other hand, Toledo has constraints covering majority of the city, and the map on the far right is what remains of unconstrained, vacant, and partially vacant land. So they have a lot less land to work with, and we recognize that. Next slide, please. So some of the key takeaways from CalTAC conversations last year are listed on this slide, including that the current rules as they are today are very vague, though this can also provide flexibility for cities with varying levels of constraints. So for some cities, it may still be feasible to build on steep slopes. For others, it's not realistic to assume that steep slopes will develop in a 20-year planning period. Another key theme is that an overall lack of data makes it difficult to map constraints to be able to accurately estimate buildable land. And so we received comments to provide more data sources and guidance to improve accuracy. And then we also discussed how to consider what we're calling islands or areas of buildable land that are surrounded by constraints, which can make the buildable area difficult to serve. And the picture here is an example of what I'm talking about. And this is not currently addressed in rule or guidance. Next slide. So as described in the memo that Cotton was talking about, the draft approach involves not drastically changing what's in rule and instead focusing more on guidance to retain current flexibility while also offering resources to improve mapping accuracy. Guidance would also include recommendations for how to consider publicly owned land, wetlands, slopes less than 25%, those islands, and CC&Rs. And at our last CowTech meeting, we presented this approach, and I'll lift up a couple of the comments, which were whether addressing publicly owned land should be addressed in rule or guidance. Wildfire hazards were also raised as a constraint that may need to be more explicitly mapped and defined. And also how to best estimate and discount capacity for slopes less than 25%. Before we move on to the discussion portion of this meeting, I'll pause to see if there are any clarifying questions on this draft approach or anything we've presented thus far. And I'll also invite, if there are any CalTech members in the room who were at our last meeting, if you would like to chime in, if there's anything I missed or something you'd like to clarify or highlight for folks.
Yeah, thanks, Jenna. So obviously open to everyone, but if there are some of the TAC folks might want to give a little more flavor, seasoning to what's been described, or kind of bring in some of the conversations y'all have. Brock, I saw you come off or onto camera. Jump in.
Yeah. So two things on this one, largely related to the Islands of Buildable Lands piece. Looking at the proposed rule and the proposed guidance topics, at the last CowTech meeting, we were talking about, or just briefly, 6E that cannot be provided with public facilities. And I believe at the time we were told there was a state statute that requires it to be cannot be served versus is infeasible to serve. Looking at the three statutes that are listed as being implemented by the rule, I didn't see that. So I was wondering if there was a citation for that statute. And then relatedly, for the island of buildable land constraints, the proposed guidance is talking about applicable to land less than 1 acre and 100% surrounded by constraints. And I'm just looking for a little bit of clarification on why less than 1 acre and why we think that 100% surrounded is the right way to go, as opposed to like surrounded in like relation to the nearest infrastructure connection point, right? So if it's fully constrained, if this is your island, it's fully constrained on this side, and the nearest infrastructure is here, you'd have to go all the way around it to be able to connect. So I think some refinement there is probably needed.
Yeah, Jenna.
Yeah, thanks, Brock. On your first point, in terms of the citation statute, we might need to get back to you on that. I don't want to spend too much time digging through our statute website right now, but we flagged it. We'll get back to you on that. So thanks for bringing that up. On the piece that is interest for folks in the memo, in the guidance section, there is a draft concept to for acres less than 1 acre and completely surrounded by constraints, that a recommendation to take that out of the buildable land inventory, because it would be really difficult to develop that parcel. And in terms of how we landed on that, honestly, I think that was just sort of thrown out there, and further research will be needed. We didn't substantially develop the guidance concepts because they don't follow the same statutory deadline. But that was an idea that was raised. I believe it was raised in a past TAC meeting. But we can go back to that, and that'll be something that'll be further researched, but open to comments on that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brock. And I think that, you might come back to that when we jump into discussion in terms of the relationship to like 1 acre and the 100%, and how is that connecting to the goal of production, affordability, and choice, and really thinking about some of the benefits and burdens of that proposed kind of approach. Thanks for naming it. Other TAC members or other folks around the rack with questions, comments, reflections? Anne?
Thank you. I just wanted to go to that CCNR's point that was on the slide at the bottom. I noticed that the latest amendment to HB 2138 had proposed to, I guess, remove that proposed provision that would make CCNRs unenforceable regardless of when they were adopted. That would preclude middle housing or ADUs or any type of housing otherwise allowed under the zoning. So I was really looking forward to that potential amendment, but it looks like maybe it's been cut back to, again, only affect CCNRs that came about after HB 2001. So I think that's kind of a pivotal thing as to whether CCNRs will, have a huge effect as constraints or not, but presently they are a pretty big deal. Just wanted to put that in there.
So is HB 2138, is that being sorry, I'm not tracking this. Is that a proposed amendment that would try to address the restrictions from CCNRs?
It was proposed to take away the date aspect so that no CCNRs, regardless of whether they were adopted before or after HB 2001 would be enforceable if they precluded housing that the zoning allows.
Okay.
And that's kind of been backpedaled in the latest amendment that I saw to that proposed legislation. So
Yeah. Ethan, you want to jump in for additional context?
Or, yeah, just maybe a resetting to what we're able to accomplish in this rulemaking process, which is to we wouldn't be able to establish rules that would, I don't know, in some way, directly interface with those CCNRs, because it is more of a legal question, definitely outside. It feels like outside of the scope of this work. However, I think what is proposed here is to kind of consider additional guidance on how local governments can interact with those in their consideration of their buildable lands inventory. I hope I got that about right, Jenna.
And I guess I work for Washington County, and for us, most of our development occurred, in more recent decades, like the 80s, the 70s. There's a lot of CCNR presence in our communities, so it might affect us more than older communities like Portland.
Thank you. And Jenna?
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna say thank you for bringing it up. We know that CCNRs exist and can be prohibitive for a lot of housing types. That said, they're difficult to track. We don't have a lot of data on them at a statewide level. So the current draft concept for guidance was a recommendation to not consider them in a city's or a jurisdiction's buildable land inventory. And that's just because of the uncertainty of we don't know whether or not they're actually being enforced. There's sort of a temporal element to it in which it is being enforced today, but it won't be enforced 10 years from now. So there's just a lot of uncertainty there, which is why we're not recommending it be included in rule. But I appreciate you bringing it up because it is a real problem.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. Thanks, John. Thanks, Ethan. Any other, let's stick to clarifying questions because we're going to jump into a discussion here. So any just clarifying questions on what was presented? Or other TAC folks that want to reflect and add a little seasoning? Yeah. Well, Jenna, do you want to introduce the questions? So we do want to have a discussion. Do you want to introduce them? I'm happy to talk through them too, but.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. I think one of the key questions we would like to ask RAC today is based on what you've heard about and what you've read on the draft approach for considering natural resource and hazard constraints in the buildable land inventory. What do you think about this approach in its ability to help cities estimate capacity and achieve housing goals? Some considerations: does this approach help achieve the goal of housing production, affordability, and choice? Does it provide the necessary clarity and certainty to local governments? And how does or doesn't the approach help mitigate burdens and extend benefits to vulnerable populations? So I'll leave it there for now, but I may have additional questions.
Okay. So let's open it up, right? So you can go in whatever direction you'd like to go. And then, if folks are struggling, maybe I'll push DLCD, use some examples, talk about some scenarios. Maybe that will help folks say, ooh, okay. In that case, right. Brock, I see you came off, you're on camera.
I am. Yeah, I was just about to put my hand up. Thank you. So one of the things that we've had repeated kind of touch points on in the CowTech discussions, but that I don't see anything here either in rule or proposed guidance, is how to consider lands that have been within a UGB for a long time and have just never had any progress towards development. So, say you've had a piece of land in there for 20 years, maybe it's one of those islands of buildable land, or a near island of buildable land, depending on how we define that. And it just has not developed, or, maybe it's even longer than 20 years. Having something in to allow for those to be pulled out would be beneficial. And then, well, I'll leave it there for now. I'll circle back on my other question if anyone else brings up the topic.
I guess just, Karen, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. We did have a couple of conversations at our TAC level. So for the broader RAC to understand, our rules fit into existing statutes. And so there are a couple statutes, and if I took a couple minutes, I could go find the exact 2 statutes that I'd want to share for those of you that don't read statutes on a weekly or daily basis. There are a couple statutes that really outline what is considered a constraint. And I want to emphasize for this group at the policy level, you are thinking very broadly, and you are not thinking down in the weeds of, how close are you to a water main line? How steep is that slope? And you can build on 25% slopes over in coastal Newport, and you wouldn't do that in Bend in the high desert. I don't want this group to think about that level of technicalities. What I want this group to really think about is there are constraints that mean that land will not be considered for housing. What is that threshold? What does that look like when we start to say, nope, we're not even going to consider it for housing? And we're confined by statutes that says you can't just, I'm going to use like I'm explaining with my kids, you can't just willy-nilly like, oh, we're not going to consider that lot, that parcel, nope, this, and all of a sudden. So for this group, really think about constraints within the context of statutes. Statutes set some parameters that rules will follow. And what these rules are intended to do is to provide us with greater clarity and certainty on how we inventory that land in compliance and in alignment with statutes. So I'll leave it at that and say that, if a piece of land hasn't developed over time, it may be a 4th generation farm at one time. And it just may not have developed, and it's going into its 5th generation, and it hasn't developed for 15, 20, 30 years. Do we want to really discount it just for that? Is it buildable? Is it someday we're going to need to use that for housing? But yes, we've had those conversations at the TAC level, and what we came to conclusion with our TAC is our rules need to be in alignment with the statutes that govern what could be considered constraint in a buildable lands inventory.
Yeah, and I think, Karen, you're going, and Anita, I'm come to you in a second. I think you were going to where maybe my question is for Brock and or others, right, is how much do we need to understand about the why, right, that land hasn't been developed? Is it because it's constrained, or is it because it's, right, a 5th generation farm? And so maybe that's a conversation we can swing back to, but Anita, jump in.
So Anne sent a chat, and maybe Anne, I'll just give you the floor. A question about CCNRs related to either guidance or rural. And you want to ask your question?
That's okay. I don't want to take up too much time on this, but and I understand why there was the response that CCNRs may not be, perpetual, but they are presently a huge roadblock to housing production, especially in fairly younger communities. So it would be, they were noted on that slide as to guidance, I believe. But it would be very helpful to have some kind of guidance on how to deal with those because they will definitely affect capacity for a very long time, if not forever. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. Ted?
Thank you. So I think the proposal strikes a good balance, both acknowledging that there's a need for certainty, but also that there are unique circumstances that are probably best addressed in guidance, that we're not going to be able to nail down every situation in rules. So there needs to be some flexibility in how jurisdictions do this work, particularly as they're thinking about how to translate buildable land into what that might amount to in terms of growth capacity over the next 20 years.
Ted? I'll ask Anita, see you came off mute.
Yeah, thanks, Miranda. It also noted that it's not just HOAs for CCNRs, but also commercial CCNRs. CCNRs can block multifamily residential in centers and corridors in certain communities. Thank you, Miranda.
Hey, Ben, can I add something I want to add something in the context of capacity, estimating capacity in relation to CCNRs. We will bring you at a later conversation. I think Jenna mentioned, we'll talk about constraints, public facility, the ability to serve, and that is a constraint. We will also bring you at a later date estimating capacity. So to Ted's point, like how much capacity do I have on this land? And if I can show some development trend data that gives me quantifiable validation to my capacity estimates, that can include CCNRs. So I want us to think about CCNRs in the context of estimating capacity, and we'll bring that discussion later if we could set it aside today. And know that for the purposes of today, rules to inventory your buildable land with constraints, CCNR, and what is a CCNR? It's a covenant or it's a restriction on the deed. For anybody that maybe wants to know more about that, it prohibits and restricts certain things happening on a property through covenants. And for the purposes of today, that is not a constraint when you're inventorying your buildable land per statutes or rules, and we're not proposing for it to be within rules.
That's helpful. So I guess folks, and maybe I'll look to DLCD. And maybe I'll just ask you to describe, would you ask the question, maybe this will be helpful, maybe it won't for folks. Does the approach help achieve the goal? Could you provide just a little more maybe articulation of what are we trying to ask people to respond to, right? When you're talking about production, affordability, and choice, right? There's kind of what's in or out of the building lands inventory, right? And there's some things that you all are working to decide, given some of the pieces on the slide, right? Floodplains and slope less than 25%, these islands conversation. But Jenna, if I was to say what are you really trying to understand from folks? To articulate the approach in a way that folks would say, yeah, I like where that's going for this reason, or I don't like where that's going because it gives me these concerns. And I don't know if that's helpful for the rest of folks, but maybe that's just a way to put a pin on it a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And I'll share some trade-offs for folks to think about. So, we recognize some cities have varying levels of constraints. Maybe folks on the coast, like Newport, they can build on really steep slopes. So they don't necessarily want to discount that from their buildable land inventory. And that's allowed with the rules and with our draft approach. Some potential trade-offs to allowing housing on really constrained land. one, it can be really expensive to build in constrained areas. We're probably not going to see a lot of affordable housing on really, really steep slopes. And it can also pose a risk to like life and safety. Building in landslide areas, that is a huge safety risk. Risk to property, and also just like to the natural environment. You know, building in natural areas, that's wildlife habitat, you know? These are protected areas. So there's a little bit of a trade-off between allowing housing in certain areas that are constrained. On the other hand, we also know some communities are like almost entirely constrained, or are very constrained. So if we were to just say, hey, you are not allowed to build on these certain constrained areas, some cities would have like very little to maybe no land left in their city to develop housing. So those are just some things to think about between thinking about like providing flexibility to local governments for determining for themselves what is reasonable to assume over a 20-year planning period, versus, you know, is that going to result in the types of housing that we want to see in 20 years? So just some food for thought.
That's super helpful, Jenna. So, and I'm just gonna maybe try to help unpack a little bit. So there's kind of a general approach around level of flexibility, right? Cities knowing best within their jurisdiction, kind of what's buildable, what's not. Even when there's constraints, they could still, like your example of Newport, they might still be able to build. So there's kind of the approach around flexibility versus kind of rigid. If it's more than 25%, we don't count it, right? If I'm not butchering that. I guess like, you know, that I hear in your example, for those cities, right, if we have flexibility, it might increase production, but it may not have it might be a decrease on affordability, and who knows about choice, right? Because you might be able to build there, but it's not going to be affordable. It's going to be expensive. So we're increasing production, but we're not accomplishing maybe some of these other things. So I guess like I'm processing it out loud, hopefully for our RAC folks to help see the conversation that might emerge. And Jenna, I really appreciate that example, right? It helps get folks thinking about both the broader approach around flexibility versus, you know, kind of direction and rule, and some of those impacts that we need to be able to hold, or those trade-offs. So I don't know if that was helpful for anybody else, but maybe that gives you a different way to kind of enter into the conversation. So having said all that, I guess what's coming up for folks. So when you think about the approach and its relationship to production, affordability, and choice, clarity and certainty, right? To Ted's kind of comment around the balance, and then burdens and benefits for vulnerable populations. Maybe I'll push for our TAC folks have been maybe chewing on this conversation a bit more. Maybe it's more reflection, maybe it's kind of where your mind's going. Yeah, Shannon?
Yeah, thanks. I guess just it's really helpful context. I appreciate the flexibility for cities. That seems really important. I think what I'm just sitting back here kind of stewing on, which is like thinking through and not having answers to, like I want to be really clear about that, are lands that might end up looking available that effectively aren't for 10 years, right? That's what I'm feeling. And if communities have a lot of that, maybe they don't have residential land. And should we be acting like they do, right? Like that does seem like a real thing to me. I'm thinking of that, 300-year farm I mean, what are the odds that someone's going to sell that in 10 years or, that homes are really going to get developed there, especially if it's not adjacent to existing infrastructure that would support residential construction? They seem low. And then maybe because of this exact day in which I find myself during the legislative session, I'm like, those CCNRs, like, whoa, they seem pretty firm. Even though we might like them not to be, right? Like the feels that way today. So I think we're talking about like a 10-year gaze, not a 100-year gaze, and maybe I have that framing wrong. But if it is a 10-year gaze, maybe it's so I guess that's a question. Like, help me with the timing frame, because maybe I have that wrong.
Well, so maybe there's two pieces in your question. So one is a timing frame, and then I guess so if it's included, and we'll just carry on with this farm, right? If the farm is included in your buildable lands, but it's not gonna happen, I think there's a so what question, right, Shannon? I don't know if you have thoughts around what's the consequence of that, right? If we include it in buildable lands, but we know it's not gonna get built, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, 10 generations, whatever the number is, what's the so what?
Yeah, and if I may follow that up, that's where it becomes I guess other things flow from that for me personally. Well, maybe the city wants to not have any more than 1-story buildings in their central corridor. But if they have no buildable lands, they might have to go vertical a little bit. Like maybe they should entertain a 3-story or 2-story townhome. It just seems to me like it could have some actual bearing on the plan in ways that do impact access and equitable access for community members. Like of all things, again, I have this very habitat frame. It's real, but it took the habitat affiliate to advocate with the city of La Pine to include townhomes in their city codes. And I know that things have happened with middle housing since then, but should that have gone down like that? Shouldn't most Oregon communities have townhomes in their code now, no matter their size, especially in Central Oregon, which is growing so much? And they were lovely, right? Like they've been lovely for that affiliate to work with. I don't mean to say that, but I guess it feels like in those kinds of scenarios, maybe the development community, even the nonprofit development community, sometimes feels like we're carrying more than our own weight.
Thanks, Shannon. And just to see the comment from Jenna in the chat around a 20-year period. Let's go with Nita. Think you're got some chat questions and comments, and then Brock will come back to you.
Sure, thank you. And this is from Shane. And so Shane wanted me to ask these questions. So I understand the role of identifying constraints. We can't work with what we don't have limits on, like slope and terrain, and wildlife, other sorts of things. But the question is, if a city municipality identifies a lot of limits to its buildable land, then does the requirements adjust to meet the housing production goal? E.g., meaning less area means they need to focus on more dense housing. I'm concerned that exclusive communities may utilize reasons of constraint when they simply may not be wanting to limit development or investment or other reasons. And then I have another question, but I think I'll wait until maybe that can be answered and then ask the next one.
Yes, any thoughts? So it's kind of the dishonesty or the illegitimate use of constraint as a barrier to production. I'm interpreting that right. Is that something that you all have talked about? Is that just a comment and a thought?
Yeah, I want to make sure I'm understanding the question and comment right. So thinking about how local governments might overestimate how much constrained land they have, maybe in an effort to get an urban growth boundary amendment potentially to add more land that is not constrained in order to meet their need. That is definitely a consideration. I mean, I think part of the I don't know if it's a trade-off, but part of the thinking around, flexibility is we are really leaving that flexibility for local governments to determine, what areas should and should not be counted in the buildable land inventory. And so that's an excellent point, Shane, and I'm so glad you brought it up. I also see Maddie with a hand up, so please jump in.
Thanks, Jenna. Madeline Phillips, Public Facilities Planning, and also a staff member to the CalTAC. Thanks everyone for using your brain power this Wednesday morning to think about these questions. This is a great opportunity to stop, first of all, and think about long-term versus short-term and some of the characteristics that are being discussed about characterizing constraints. Shannon, thanks so much for bringing up these questions about counting land in the UGB. Brock, you brought it up too, counting land in the UGB that's being used for something that's maybe many generations long, and the question of whether or not we can count on that capacity in this 20-year planning horizon, which we consider to be a long-term look. There's obviously a shorter-term look, which we'll bring to you next RAC meeting, which will focus on development ready land, and that's land inside of city limits or just immediately adjacent to city limits. I guess I always think about this like bread and butter numbers, like what can a city count on? And when we think about the risk and reward of including constrained land in a city's capacity for that long-term look, there are risks and rewards. So the reward is we can look at land that might be more difficult to build on because it has some constraint, like a physical constraint that we're talking about here, whether that's floodplain risk or that's slope risk of different magnitudes. There are public and private risks to that. But thinking about it, like, should a city count on that land as capacity for the housing units they need? So another way to look at it is, should the market assume or encourage development of that land at a certain urbanized density? Or is there a likelihood that to ask the market to produce that, or even to subsidize the market to produce that housing in the case of affordable units, might take an inordinate amount of either capacity, like resource or risk? And so the thing we're trying to reach here that Jenna very eloquently explained in some of her explanation was, how do we find the balance of what's enough protection for a jurisdiction to say we can really count on these units being built either through the market forces or through subsidized housing opportunities? Or is it so risky that by putting our capacity in this land, it's unlikely, if ever, to happen? In which case we create something that we've called affectionately phantom capacity. It's capacity on paper, but it's never going to either pencil out or be likely to be worth the risk. And so this is hopefully maybe characterizing that a little differently, helps us look at the question and helps stir discussion, and also helps us think in the long term, if that committed use, if that land changes hands over that 20-year period, because it's a committed use, is it a committed use with a conservation easement on it? That's one thing. If it's a committed use that's simply been committed in practice, but might in that 20-year horizon be eligible or provide an opportunity to change its use, i.e. urbanize or increase its density or intensification of use, then there's some real value in keeping it in the inventory. Even if that farm is living into its 5th generation, there are just different decisions that folks make intergenerationally. But in this case, we're thinking about things that are physical constraints that really can't be changed. They can be mitigated, but it really can't be changed as to how much risk it might pose to both private and public facilities. Go for it, Shannon.
Yeah, if I may, and I see other hands, so I don't mean to take up too much of the space. I guess I just find myself sitting here like kind of wanting those kinds of lands to get a risk rating. Like maybe they don't count as 100% available. Like maybe they count as 50% available when you're looking at your total buildable lands inventory for a 20-year horizon, or and maybe that's asking too much, but that's where my brain goes.
It's not asking for too much, and your brain is just a couple meetings ahead. When we think about capacity and development trend data, we'll get to that, Shannon. So you're just getting ahead of us. Yep.
Awesome.
Or you're on track where the TAC has been. You're just getting ahead of the rack.
So that's, Anita, were you?
Yeah, I had a second question follow up from Shane, so I wanted to ask that real quickly. It's kind of, I think, within this thread. It says if housing is more limited, how will a city guarantee to prioritize needed housing for low income populations? It seems like it's easy to state we can't build a lot of housing, thus we gotta attract more expensive development to make up for this missing volume. And I think Shannon had addressed a little bit about like density and housing type in different communities. And so that question for DLCD staff.
Great. Thank you. So Karen, let's go to you, and then I think it was Brock, then Ann.
Shane, you did so beautifully with that question, tying land supply to all the conversations you all have had, production, affordability, and choice. Because that is exactly where that question marries those two things. So a city that is very constrained, I'm going to pick on one city and they won't mind it. We had some discussions with the city of Astoria, and they've got a lot of forest land, they've got an ocean, they've got some bay estuary. I mean, they're just all sorts of constraints around them. And they really, Alyssa Gertler sits on the RAC and the TAC, and she works in that county. And so she knows a lot of those cities in that county have this very problem that you bring up. And so they are really looking at what are the production strategies that they have and what are some land use efficiency measures that they can take. They're looking at very unique tools of urbanization of what's called a UGB exchange or a swap. Are there certain lands that we know are highly forested and they're somehow in our UGB? Can we swap those out for other lands? But it's really difficult for them to find land to swap in. And you're right, that's where these production strategies are intended to come in, is how do we build more efficiently within our urban growth boundary and within our city boundaries. But as well, I think the point you make is now that each city gets a housing need allocation, they don't get to just build units for the sake of units. That housing need allocation, remember, is divided by, or it's put into buckets of income, affordability, and housing need. So your city has a housing need allocation for housing at these income levels, these household income levels, and this affordability levels. So cities will be looking at more efficient land use and production strategies in meeting those housing targets by income level. So there's no way for a city to comply with owner rules that were adopted last year and build only those high income units or those middle income units. There's no compliance pathway for that. So I thought I would just bring those two things together because that's exactly what we're talking about today.
Thanks, Karen. Ethan, were you trying to add on to this? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add that this is truly the like existential fundamental question of this work is cities have the option to, when faced with how are we going to meet our needs, the options are focus on building inside of our city or grow the city or a mixture of both. All right, if you play with the capacity of lands and say we have less capacity in our existing city, then that corresponds with potentially a greater response of saying, well, we need to grow our city to a larger extent. And so this decision about, or these questions about what's the ability for a local government to take lands off or include lands in their buildable lands inventory has that's the outcome of, that's what informs that decision-making process. How much is a city then responding inside of their existing boundary, or how much they need to then grow their boundary? Those are, that's kind of, that's why those that's why those decisions on which things come off and which things stay on are, important, because it leads right into that decision-making process.
That's great. Thank you, Ethan. So thanks, Brock and Ann, for your patience. Let's go Brock, then Ann, and then I'm gonna move us, kind of in relationship to what you just talked about, Ethan, into the kind of second part of this conversation. But Brock?
Yeah, and I'll be quick because I think Shannon and I had a little bit of telepathy there. So for like, the example with the multi-generational farm, right? If we're concerned that because of the way that statute is written or for any other reason that we wouldn't be able to discount that in the BLI, just saying, okay, unless you have, some kind of like justifiable validation as to why you think this land is going to now develop in the next 20 years when it hasn't for the past 20, 40, 60, then capacity is just assumed to be zero, but it still gets to stay in the buildable land inventory. And I realize that's again, jumping ahead, but.
Yeah, thanks, Brock. Ann?
I love what Shannon said. So more power to that kind of thing from here. I want to say right now we're talking about formal cities, really. Metro counties are also subject to this, and we have our unique constraints that are less quantifiable. It's very hard to put a boundary around those. When you're talking, Ethan, about, how much do cities need to grow to be able to achieve their allocations, their targets, counties can't do that. So we have a whole set of constraints that are working together. And, when we think of this 20-year timeline, we have a shrinking capacity of land to meet our targets. Washington County's urban area would be the second largest city in Oregon if it were a city. So we have a very large allocation of housing to meet. At the same time, we're covered with CCNRs. I would love it if those could just go away. But we also have, these companion constraints where we can't expand, we cannot annex land to meet our targets. And we have cities annexing from our land to meet their targets. So, while we're unique, we're still a big consideration, metro counties. And I think that the ability to define constraints in a really hardline way is going to be difficult for metro counties. So just hoping that flexibility factor will consider that.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Ann. Well, let's pivot. So we've kind of talked about buildable lands inside UGB, and we were kind of pivot to the boundary study areas conversation. Is it you again?
Yeah. So this is very much related to the topic we just talked about. But we're going to be talking more about what happens if you have a deficiency of land in your buildable land inventory, and you might pursue an urban growth boundary or boundary amendment to add or swap land in your current boundary. And so this involves, if a city is pursuing this involves analyzing a study area, and very similar to a buildable land inventory, removing land from that study area that is considered unsuitable because it is subject to landslides, flooding, tsunamis, maybe it has significant resources, or is owned and managed by the federal government, and therefore not suitable to be brought into the urban growth boundary. And while this process is similar to the process of removing land in removing that natural resource and hazard land in a buildable land inventory, some of the specific constraints listed in rule are a little different, and that's described a little bit in that same discussion memo. But by estimating these constraints in a study area, a city can then make decisions about which areas may be the most suitable for future housing and urbanization. Next slide. So these are some of the key takeaways from Caltech discussions last year, which include that listing specific data sources in rule can create challenges for local governments wanting to use other types of data sources that may be more accurate. So an idea was shared to just cite specific sources in guidance only to create more flexibility. TAC members also, we received some comments that some TAC members appreciated the current structure of how the rules are written, which at present include an initial analysis of the study area, followed by a deeper, more detailed analysis for continuing to remove land that may be considered unsuitable. Liquefaction and hydric soils were also raised as a hazard that is not currently mentioned in rule, but should be considered as an additional constraint. Next slide. And the discussion memo describes in more detail the draft rule and guidance concepts for considering unsuitable land in urban growth boundary study areas, with the goal of providing flexibility, clarity, and support to local governments doing this work. We are also not proposing to drastically change the rules, but making some changes in response to feedback, including moving data sources from rule to guidance and adding liquefaction to that list of hazards to be considered. And in addition to data recommendations, guidance would also focus on recommendations for considering those same types of like islands surrounded by constraints, as well as land constrained by floodplain or other types of hazards. And I'll just name some of the comments from our Caltech meeting last week. Wildfire hazard areas were brought up as an additional constraint not mentioned, though there was some discussion about the uncertainty of future use of wildfire maps and data sources, as well as how to mitigate wildfire risk through certain construction methods rather than just like completely ruling these areas out for potential development. There were comments raising the need for a clear threshold for identifying and excluding liquefaction areas, since this can vary by location and soil type, for example. There were comments raised consideration for other types of habitat and wildlife corridors that are not explicitly stated in rule. As well as we received some comments to better align the buildable land inventory and urban growth boundary study area rules so that the same constraints are removed from both the study area and the areas inside a city. We also received other comments that data sources used excluding related to comments, sorry. We received comments related to certain which data sources are best for excluding areas that may be subject to flooding risk, tsunami risk, as well as the need to continuously review and update any data sources we might put in the guidance materials, since that can get outdated through the years. So again, I'll pause to see if there are any clarifying questions. And Caltech members, please feel free to chime in on anything I may have missed or from our discussion last week.
Thanks, Jenna. And we're going to ask the same set of questions as well that we just went through, so we can kind of preview those if we want. But before getting there, any clarifying questions or for TAC members? Anything you want to bring into the discussion? Then I have a question of curiosity around like wildfire. Like, did you all talk about the wildfire map, which is I won't describe it, I think being discussed, I'll just say. Is that part of the conversation y'all have had as a potential data source?
It did come up in conversation, as well as potential inability to rely on that on that wildfire map in the future. So that was discussed at our conversation last week, and I'd invite any Caltech members to chime in on what we discussed. There was some discussion about maybe other types of data sources could be used to map and estimate wildfire hazard risk areas, which will take some further research on our part. But yeah, there was also a comment made about, well, should these areas that are at risk of wildfire hazard, should they just be excluded from the study area, or could we still potentially urbanize these areas, and maybe we just think about how to mitigate that risk through certain construction methods, for example?
Yep, that's helpful. Thanks. Yeah, Brock.
Yeah, kind of two quick comments. One specifically related to the wildfire portion. I can't remember who it was that was saying this last time, or during the last Caltech meeting. But the primary concern was the existing structures, but that with, updated code, for like, like R327, makes those properties substantially less risky from the standpoint of wildfire. So I think that's just an important thing to keep in consideration. And I think that is a reasonable justification to say that they shouldn't be removed entirely. And then additionally, unrelated to the wildfire portion, I think having that kind of consistency between what is being considered as buildable land within the UGB versus in a planned expansion area is a really important thing to look at. Because if we're not considering those criteria before we bring it in, then we end up in a situation where we do end up with that kind of phantom capacity that Madeline was talking about, where, the land might now be in the UGB, but it's still not going to develop, even though it met the criteria to come in, but now it doesn't meet the criteria to really be truly buildable.
Yeah, thank you, Brock. Steve, I'm wondering, I see in the middle of my screen, if you have thoughts around either reflections from the TAC conversations that have been happening, or if there's questions that you feel are either connected to or addition to that would be helpful as you all continue to have your conversations. But just wanted to create some space if you had thoughts for the group.
I appreciate, excuse me, appreciate that, Ben. Steve Faust, 3J Consulting, and I work with the DLCD team to facilitate the CowTAC. In this particular case, I don't have anything significant to add. I think Jenna's done a great job capturing the conversation. Brock obviously has been part of those conversations. It brings that perspective to the table. I would say that I think the reaction from the TAC at our meeting was that the team did a good job of capturing those previous conversations that we had in the first phase of our work. But again, people are kind of hitting on the points that they raised, whether it be the wildfire issue or some of the capacity versus constraints conversations that we've had. So thanks for the opportunity. There's not much at this point that I have to add.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to give you a chance to reflect if you had anything additional. So there's kind of an approach around the relationship to production, affordability, choice. There's the approach around clarity and certainty, and then there's the approach relationship to benefit and burden.
I thought Brock brought up an interesting point that I'll just speak to a little bit more. And it's described a little bit in that same discussion memo about why would you bring in land that may be constrained into the urban growth boundary, and then later maybe it's like not even buildable when you're doing your buildable land inventory. And so at present, the rules, the constraints in the urban growth boundary study area rules and the constraints in the buildable land inventory rules don't totally align. And so you could bring in land that is constrained that is later considered not buildable. And a reason a city might do this is for a few reasons. One being that sometimes land that is constrained could still be used potentially for parks for nearby residents, for example, open space. It may also just be for good urban form, so you don't have like super weird boundaries where it's like, oh, we're just going to discount this area. And that can create a lot of confusion, honestly, for communities who may not realize that they're not in the city, but they're like right across the street from someone who is. So those are just, a couple reasons why. That said, we did receive that comment last week that maybe we should better align the constraints in the in those two rural areas so that you're not constantly bringing in land that is later considered not suitable for housing development.
Thanks, Jenna. So Kevin, we haven't heard from you, so I'm going to come to you, and then Brock, I'll jump back to you.
Thank you, Ben. And I'm Kevin Young. I'm a senior urban planner with the LCD. I look at a lot of UGB decisions. And so I just kind of wanted to support what Jenna was just saying. And, another reality for cities who are doing urban growth boundary expansions is that they don't have the same level of information about potential lands that might come into the urban growth boundary. It takes a lot of time and resources for a city to do an inventory of significant natural features, to conduct a local wetland inventory, and then figure out, okay, which of these wetlands do we need to protect or not protect? And so to some degree, they're not exactly the same because you don't have the same level of information that you would have in your buildable land inventory, where presumably much of that work has already been done. You're looking at lands within your current jurisdiction. So I just kind of want to make that point that it can be complex, and cities don't necessarily know as much at the time of UGB expansion about, those particular lands and what future decisions will be made about them.
Yeah, thanks for that additional context, Kevin. Brock?
Yeah, and I totally agree with what Jenna and Kevin said there, right? Obviously there are reasons why you would want to bring that land in, even if it doesn't have development capacity for, reasonable boundaries, right? Adding parks, things like that. I wonder if that maybe should prompt a discussion around, so like, say, for example, the city decides that it needs 50 new acres of buildable lands to be able to support its 20-year production target, right? But let's say they identify a spot and they're like, okay, this is probably the best location to move towards, right? But 10 acres of that 50 that would be brought in, which given current data limitations might be thought of as buildable, right? If there's like a reason that we might think, hey, maybe that 10 acres is better to be used as a park, then that counts as something that you get added to your UGB, right? But then you need to find another 5 acres or another 10 acres elsewhere to include in that addition as well. And that way you have those parks planned for, but you're also not unintentionally or inadvertently reducing the actual capacity of the land that you're bringing in.
Yeah. Karen, did you want to respond to that?
I'm actually not going to respond to that because that is a capacity question, and I know we've talked about it in the TAC, and I know we will bring that in the future to the RAC. But I've learned from last year to repeat some lingo that's really important language. So I said I wouldn't use a bunch of lingo, but I'm going to right here, and I'm just going to repeat it. And you're going to hear me repeat this over and over. There is a 20-year housing need allocation. and I just want us to use that word, housing need allocation. And we are planning for our housing need based on that housing need allocation that's broken up by income. And then cities above 10,000 population will have a housing production target. And that's their short term, near term. It's either 8 years or 6 years. So I'm going to keep repeating that every chance I just, if I hear it and need to say it again. So there's a 6 to 8 year production target. You'll inventory your land based on that development ready land inventory. That's a brand new thing. Historically, for decades, we've been doing 20-year housing need planning. And new is DAS will give us a housing need allocation. Cities and counties or jurisdictions will get their housing need allocation. That's all I want to do.
All right, thank you. Miranda?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm not feeling very well this morning, so I'm gonna be off camera. I apologize for that. But I just wanted to jump on quick and reiterate the things that Kevin said. I think there is a distinction to be made between when we're studying areas that are in our urban reserves or outside the UGB versus when we're doing a full-on buildable lands inventory for things like our housing capacity analysis or employment opportunities analysis. So I would I guess just kind of voice my support for that. And then I would also note that it operates a little bit different, at least especially in the metro region, in terms of capacity of UGB areas. So in the example that Brock was giving, if 50 acres is brought in, for example, when we did this work in our Frog Pond East and South area, we do an analysis at that point when it comes into the urban growth boundary for things like significant resource overlay zone and significant tree grows. Anything that ends up being put into like our goal 5, those are our SROZ is what is goal 5 lands. So anything that ends up being designated as goal 5 just gets taken out as buildable, but the same requirement for number of housing units is still placed on that entire area. So now, like in the scenario Brock gave, if it was 50 acres and 10 acres is now goal 5, we just have to put all those housing units on on the 40 buildable acres as opposed to on all 50 acres. So the capacity of the land that's brought in doesn't get reduced. And so I just want to make that note because there might be some assumption there that we now only have 40 acres. And so that's reduced the capacity. And now we need to go find 10 more acres. But that's not actually the case. We provide the same capacity just on less land.
Good, thank you, Miranda. Feel better. Maddie?
In the interest of the group having a good understanding of some of the outcomes of bringing in land that's not necessarily able to support a full urbanized capacity, we're going to bring to you in future meetings just to plant the seed and build some thinking around it, around the idea that those expansion areas might support community amenities and things that create something that we might call a complete community. So the ability for folks who live in those expansion areas to access a park or a neighborhood commercial opportunity, or things that a corner store, places that help support people's everyday lives within immediate proximity of where they live. That's something that we'll talk about a little bit more at a future meeting, but thinking about if those lands are included in a buildable land inventory, even if they're not able to produce the kinds of housing that we might need or think that they ought to contribute to that inclusion, they might be a park that in the future helps support a 20-minute neighborhood that's located in those expansion areas. So when we think about choice and the ability for folks to access housing in places that have a high level of amenity, sometimes bringing in land that has some kind of constraint might offer an opportunity in the future for a community to do that.
Thank you, Maddie. Well, folks, we're at 11:15. I know we have another agenda item to move to, and probably could do a little bit of stretching and filling in the water and the coffee and all that stuff. So appreciate the conversation. We'll provide, there'll be, post-meeting survey and other kind of methods as you all consider kind of in let this process. You have the questions that we asked. So why don't we take 10 minutes, maybe 9.5 minutes. We'll come back at 11:25. And we'll move into the housing action work group discussion. Thanks, everybody. Oh, perfect timing. Thank you, Ingrid. So 11:25, welcome back, folks. We're just gonna dive right in. So Stina, Thea, who's kicking us off?
That'll be me, Ben.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Hi, everyone. Thea Croman, she, her pronouns. I'm a housing planner with DLCD, and really glad to be back in this space with you all after this long hiatus. So I am here to sort of kick off our conversation about the Housing Actions Work Group and, you know, jump into some conversation about that, and we'll come back to you certainly a few more times to talk through the progress there. Like you saw at the top, Ethan sort of introduced you to the new scope that that the HOG is working through, and I'll just real quick bring us back to what that is. There's essentially three areas of work, and one is the development of adoption-ready actions, including model codes that affirmatively further fair housing. The second is the development and rule adoption of clear compliance pathways through the HPS and acceleration programs. And finally, the development of guidance, including a Goal 10 guidebook and a revamp of the menu of actions, although I will say we're spending the bulk of the time as a work group on those first two bullets. So we have two frameworks that are in place to ensure that sort of as the group descends into the weeds, we're really guided by a set of clear commitments. So here what you see on the screen is our North Star, the HOG policy objectives. Those are, in short, to promote inclusive zoning, to enable a diversity of housing options, to produce and retrofit areas in high opportunity areas, increasing housing choice related to equity-driven needs, to streamline housing, the development processes for housing, and to increase community capacity and resilience in support of equitable housing production. So these are our policy objectives that we use to sort of guide our decision-making processes. Can move to the next slide, please, Ellen. And I wanted to stop on this slide again real quickly, acknowledging that the harms that have and continue to be perpetuated by land use policies and the field of planning really broadly, we make sure to base all of our conversations and decisions in this racial equity framework that you all know pretty well, was adopted by our commission. So going to the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the adoption-ready actions element of the HOG work. So what are adoption-ready actions? Building off of the definition of action that was developed by our colleagues in 2024, we're working with a working definition of adoption-ready actions. That means an action that's partially or fully developed and implementable. So it's an action that's designed to reduce development resource needs for communities while really supporting the principles of Goal 10 housing. An adoption-ready action requires some elements of universal applicability, but the level of adoption readiness may vary, and we can talk a little bit more about what that means exactly in the next few slides. All right, so where are we now in the process? We have been meeting as a work group since January. And I want to talk a little bit through the process, through the systematic process that we've been going through to get to the point of drafts, which are due in June. So we started with sort of a framework and some examples. Those we met as a group in January and in February on those. We presented a set of alternatives, so narrowed from those examples based on HOG feedback and research. We presented that on March 12th. Right now, we are in the process of sort of working through the feedback on the alternatives to develop a proposal for how we want to proceed with a set of adoption ready actions and a framework for those. And again, we'll be bringing drafts in June. Then between June and January is a period of refinement. So we have a sort of a compressed timeline to get to the drafts. And after that, a little while to work through the details. We can go to the next slide. So how did we get to what a good adoption ready action is? And we sort of worked closely with consultants to figure out how to determine what actions are not only great actions, but are also sort of the most eligible, the most useful for cities and local jurisdictions across the state. We came up with a set of criteria, sort of in the middle of your screen here. So those are aligned. The action can be targeted towards addressing a relevant housing need or policy outcome. So legal, it's legal under current Oregon state law. That it is local, that the action is one that a local jurisdiction can take, that it's effective, that there's some type of evidence that suggests that the action really has a measurable impact on the intended outcome, that it is applicable, so sort of broadly applicable across a range of jurisdictions within the state, and that it can be used often enough to really justify the effort of creating it. So we want to see it sort of broadly adopted. That it's durable, that the action is likely to be impactful for the foreseeable future. It's not going to sort of peter out or stop being effective at some point. That it's generalizable, that it can be developed in a way that the local government can use really off the shelf with little or no localized analysis, as little as possible. That it's valuable. So really having the ARA would make it meaningfully easier or less costly for governments to implement the action. As we worked through these criteria, it became clear that there are very few actions that are truly immediately adoptable and implementable. But that didn't mean that there wasn't utility in developing out elements of adoption readiness. So we came up with this framework that's here on the right side of your screen, where level 3 means those that are the closest to being immediately adoptable and implementable. Level 2 means actions that are largely developed, but do require some local customization and testing to ensure that they're really going to have the effect that is hoped for. And finally, level 1, these are partially developed. So some components of the action is developed, but they do require sort of substantial local preparation. And when we go to the next couple of slides, I'll walk you through some examples of those. So this is what we have as our sort of first slate of adoption ready actions. What you see in green is what we are developing right now. So before our June deadline, the ones in green will be developed as adoption ready actions. The ones in blue are sort of set up to be addressed next, to be developed next, and the ones in yellow are on the list but need further research. As you can see, level 3, so those most immediately adoptable and implementable, there's very few of them. So and then at level 2, you see sort of a greater number that that can be applied. We can go to the next slide. And I'm not walking you through all of these because we just don't have time, but we can look back at these if you want to in discussion. Finally, level 1, these are partially developed at the state level. There's a sort of far more of these. So these are actions that we think actually are some of the most highly impactful ones. And the state hopes to develop elements of the, of the sort of package to help a local jurisdiction get to the point of being able to adopt these without too terribly much local work. So I think, I'm not sure if I have other slides about adoption ready actions. At this point, we're going to move on to sort of the second focus of the HOG work, and I will hand it off to my colleague Celestina.
Thanks so much, Thea. As Thea just mentioned, we'll dig into the compliance pathways element of the scope, and I'm going to try and be as succinct as possible to hear y'all's thoughts. I know at the top of the meeting we heard some interest in this topic in particular already. So we'll do a little bit of review from last year and then bring you all along about how our conversation has continued. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a table of different ways that we can conceptualize this idea of compliance pathways. And we heard Tara mention at the top of the meeting, is the work of the HOG pursuing safe harbors. And so you all know that we brought to you last year a conversation about whether or not to develop safe harbors for the housing production strategy, contextualized housing need, and even housing acceleration program work. And we didn't pursue it in sort of developing the base rules of the program, but as we discussed earlier today, we are directed to do that. And so not only do we have safe harbors as a potential way to think about these more formal ways to complete the program requirements, there are some others as well that we did begin just briefly to talk about last year. And this table illustrates those from the left to the right, starting from least prescriptive, meaning there's more flexibility. The safe harbor is actually just an option, all the way to a more prescriptive approach. And on that end of the spectrum, we have regulatory requirement, meaning something must be done and it must be done only in the exact way that it's named. No more work can be done. So in between there, we've got rebuttable presumption, which means that it's still whatever the prescription is that's applied to complete any given part of our work. It's still optional in a way, though it is expected. We're presuming it. It's the rebuttable presumption that a local government proceed in this way. But if there is a demonstration as to why that's not the best fit, that presumption can be rebutted. A local government could take another path with demonstrating why. Another option is to pursue work developing these compliance pathways or some versions of them as minimum standards. So that means that a local government would have to do some of their Goal 10 work in a particular way, but they could also do additional work beyond that, and that would be permitted. So those are some of the those are the terms that we've been using to try and understand this question of levels of prescription and levels of flexibility that we talked a lot about last year and we're digging into more now. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. And this is just a review. You saw these 3 rule areas in Ethan's presentation earlier in the morning about the rule sections that were already adopted in December 2024 that we're adding this compliance pathway sort of on top of, almost layering as a way through the program in addition to the base rules. Now, where we've come over the last few months is that there is more clarity and sort of shared understanding around what a compliance pathway might look like through doing the contextualized housing need work, identifying housing need, and the housing production strategy work, taking action to meet that need. And there is some continued discussion around the acceleration program and how we might be able to apply some of these more prescriptive compliance pathways. But at the moment, we don't have a proposal in that realm. And so we're mostly tabling that for today. And just to name exactly why, that's because the Housing Acceleration Program is intended to sort of audit when there are persistent issues that the best made plan, as we say, of the housing production strategy didn't seem to fix, that we're having some real major barriers to housing production, affordability, and choice, even when the housing production strategy was implemented for this underperformance pathway of being in the acceleration program. And so we've been struggling to find a way to standardize something like that when we really know that we're trying to identify something that maybe the rest of the program wasn't able to accomplish, and that might need sort of a magnifying glass or the ability to look into other places other than a standardized approach. But we are continuing to talk about that. So you'll see for the rest of the presentation and discussion today, we're going to only be talking about the contextualized housing need and housing production strategy. I want to frame the compliance pathways just for a moment in the context of those existing rules that were adopted last year. So again, the existing rules name the contextualized housing need as a local analysis to determine housing need. And the housing production strategy is work to strategize actions to take based on the local context to meet those housing needs. And we've noted here that community engagement and tribal consultation are a required element of this work under those base rules. And so when we talk about compliance pathways, we can go to the next slide and think about what it would look like to layer on that local governments may or must, that's getting back to that spectrum of like safe harbor, minimum standard, rebuttable presumption, which is always at play when we're talking about this compliance pathway, that a local government may or must, for example, for the contextualized housing need, utilize some state provided housing needs. So a more standardized approach to say that a local government uses something that exists at the state level rather than this localized analysis. Or in the case of the housing production strategy, a way that would be applied would be to say that a local government might take state provided housing actions. And again, this level of prescription would be that they may do that or they must do that. And you'll also see the word also on the slide. And that's important because in this sort of application of compliance pathways, we could retain the role of the existing rules to say that local governments still need to do that local analysis to determine their housing needs and still need to select actions to meet those needs sort of on their own. But there may be some portion of that work that is completed through a compliance pathway or that could be completed through a compliance pathway, and that not all of the work can be done in more of this standardized way. But on the next slide, sort of given us a visual aid about another way that compliance pathways can be used. Oh, you were right. Yes, perfect. Thank you. Which is to say that actually they serve this full compliance purpose, that that pursuing them, whether it's optional or not, really precludes the need to do that local analysis, and the standardization is sort of more full throttle. It really covers the entire program requirement. And so that's one of the questions that's on the table in discussion of developing these rules is are the compliance pathways able to be developed in this full way, or is it more limited? And so with that on the next slide, we can sort of talk about where we are in having these conversations. So similar to how Thea illustrated a timeline for developing those adoption-ready actions, we've got this timeline of really refinement on these compliance pathway questions. And you'll see that we're coming out of, largely coming out of the alternatives phase and starting to approach proposals. As we're maybe, as you can see sort of visually, maybe about halfway through this 6-month period of trying to conceptualize all the possible options that are on the table and narrow down to something that we think is a pretty decent draft come June. And on the next slide, we'll dig in just a little bit more into the contextualized housing need, and then we'll have a similar slide on the housing production strategy, and then we'll open up for discussion. So again, I'll try and keep this somewhat brief, but where we are in time, coming off of that timeline, in discussing the contextualized housing need, identifying the needs in local governments, is at this options or examples phase. So we've drafted a number of ways that we could consider how to somewhat standardize or fully standardize identifying housing types that are needed, housing characteristics that are needed, and housing locations that are needed. Those terms may ring a bell from last year's work because that's sort of the framing that we have from the statute that the housing production strategy works to and needed housing is sort of identified in this way of housing types, characteristics, and locations. So how might we standardize something like that, or whether that's optional or required? So for housing types, I'll name just a couple examples. One of the ones that you all actually saw last year and is still on the table for discussion is housing type mix that is scaled by city size. So certain percentages of each housing type mix that can be used depending on the population of a given city. Another approach could be to say, actually, rather than this discrete housing type mix, what if we had incremental increases toward a goal type mix? And how might that serve to accomplish our policy objectives? For characteristics, we have fewer options really on the table because the how might I say this? Sort of the framing of housing types is the easiest to quantify. We have these more familiar and discrete categories of housing types, although there is even some gray area in there. But generally, we have a lot of familiarity around multi-unit and middle housing and even single unit detached housing. The world of characteristics is really varied. You know, a housing characteristic includes affordability. It includes the degree to which it is accessible or adaptable to folks with disabilities. Those are sort of very different frames. And so the way that we've been working with the HOG on answering this question is around key needs. And is there a way that we can identify sort of some standards or benchmarks for a certain set of key needs? And would that be sufficient for the contextualized housing need work? On its own, or should we try and pursue every need sort of imaginable that we can think of? And what does that do to how we roll out the program? And then lastly, I just want to note that for the question about locations, as Maddie was mentioning a little bit earlier, we have the ideas of how we implement fair housing choice and questions about locations of housing within a city and opportunity, the level of opportunity that's available in different neighborhoods. And we are working on a methodology and ultimately a map to help local governments understand some of those questions that could then be utilized um, in a compliance pathway as well. And lastly, the housing production strategy. So this is the work on identifying needs. And on the next slide, we say, what do we do about those needs? How do we pick actions to meet these needs? And so we presented 4 different alternatives to the HOG about how we might approach that. As you can see, a lot of this work is pretty technical and in the weeds. So we will be interested in hearing your thoughts, but that's part of why we're sort of giving this update out a little bit. So some of the alternatives are on the simpler side, as you can see by the titling of the simple menu option, and also offer more flexibility. And again, trying to work through this spectrum of flexibility versus prescription. And so the option at the bottom of the slide, statewide requirements, takes an approach of more prescription about very specific actions being required to be taken. To go back to that simple menu option, one of the ways that we talked with the HOG about building out this compliance pathway was to suggest that maybe one action needed to be taken to meet any given need off of a menu. You know, every time I say it out loud, I just think how simplistic, but it's an option that is really straightforward and sort of digestible for folks. So it is something that's on the table. 2 options that are sort of in the middle are impact rating and points-based scoring, and both of them are trying to get at the idea of how do we understand a broader range of actions and how a local government might combine, you know, a high impact and a low impact to meet a given housing need and not get caught with a very low low impact set of actions at the end of the day without considering that. So with that, I know it's a lot of information, but we hoped to couch it sort of in the progress of this work. I know we had some questions off the bat that we might dig into, and just know that we're also available to receive comments other ways as well, because I know we're short on time.
Yeah, thanks, Celestina. So, and Thea, so I guess if there's clarifying questions or things that are kind of right in front of your mind right now that you'd like to bring in the room, that would be great. And I appreciate you both kind of framing this as kind of an update, bringing people into the world that y'all are navigating. But let me pause. Any questions, reflections? I'm not seeing any. Okay. Well, let's move to the last slide and we're gonna, I'm gonna preemptively just remind folks that there's multiple ways to give input, and I recognize, sometimes processing in the moment or, waiting to hear from the conversation may be challenging for folks. So knowing that, we do have the email, we're gonna put some materials out here. We do have the post-meeting survey. We have Rack Buddies. There's multiple ways that I really encourage folks to bring your voice into the space, and sometimes that just means you need a little more space to process than processing in front of 40 other people. So Karen, I think you're going to tee this up in terms of what we're asking for a little follow-up for today's meeting. Do you want to?
We're hoping you guys are okay with a little bit of homework, and you can start that homework right now. I think Ellen's going to put a link to a Miro board. The answers on this slide are also on the Miro board, and you can start answering those. But we'll send out our typical monthly post-rack survey. So I know SurveyMonkey is a more accessible tool for folks. These exact same questions are on the SurveyMonkey. And the intent is to get to know each of you a little bit better in the context of land supply, urbanization, land capacity, and development readiness of land. So we've outlined these 3 questions for you. We invite you to share what you can and what you're willing to share with us to get to know you a little bit better.
Thanks, Karen. And so you can see the way these questions are framed by really kind of thinking about your relationship with community and how communities plan for housing, to your individual interests, right? To kind of get to know where folks are coming from and to really hear that directly, to hear your priorities, how it might affect community or communities that you serve. So again, getting into some of that benefits and burdens, some of that racial equity framework questions that we're really hoping to unpack. And I think, the team tries to do its best to bring kind of the most relevant, up-to-date information. But if there are things that you're seeing, for example, in the Housing Action Work Group scope of work that you're most interested in diving into deeper, that's helpful to hear and know from you all, to align our agendas. Again, as I said right at the beginning, right, we're really being really purposeful with the way that we frame our agendas and trying to be reflective of what your interests are, as well as the agency needs in terms of some of these really challenging and dynamic issues. And then anything else that you want to name. And I just really encourage folks to, going back to maybe some of our group agreements, to be candid, to be constructive, right, to help us help you be as effective as you can in the space. And as Karen was alluding to, we'll have the Miro board, if that's something you can dive into now, if you want to start answering those. But again, making sure there's multiple mechanisms, the Miro board, the survey. I'm going to say it out loud, and then I'm going to pass it to you, Ethan, to talk a little bit more about. I think we've been referencing buddies quite a bit, but maybe giving some context to that. And then, of course, you can always email the team through the housing.dlcd@dlcd.oregon.gov. So, Ethan, do you want to give a little more context to the buddy model?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Ben. And, thank you all for the discussion today. I just want to hammer home the point that the Mirror Board and the post-meeting survey, there's 2 opportunities to provide input. They've got substantially similar questions, except for the point about rack buddies. So in 2024, for folks who are participating in a rulemaking advisory committee for the first time or are coming in with perspectives that are certainly related, but are put them in a position where some of this the content of this rulemaking is very technical in nature and even somewhat confusing. There's an existing kind of program that we ran in 2024 called these DLCD RAC buddies, which pairs a RAC member with a DLCD housing division staff person to kind of just go through those items in a little bit more detail on a like more one-on-one kind of environment, both to share knowledge and perspectives and kind of provide clarification to the content, but also to support and facilitate that person's participation in the discussion in these meetings in particular. And so we're starting at this kind of second phase of the rulemaking process. So just wanted to kind of highlight that opportunity again for folks. If you are interested in that, or that would, if, reflecting on your experience in 2024, you're like, oh gosh, I really could have used some like additional conversation on this piece because I truly don't know how to interact in the actual meeting. So we're definitely opening that opportunity up again for 2025. And if you're interested in that, you can let us know through that post-meeting survey that will be sent after this meeting. So
that's great, Ethan. I appreciate you kind of giving some language to or some description to the language, and I'll just further encourage folks to take that up. So you can feel like you can come into this space, ask the kind of questions maybe you don't want to, and in the full meeting, get some dialogue going. And then, the other thing that I'll ask as folks are going through and responding to these questions, I hope some of what you're feeling today is both in the questions, but also in some of this follow-up, really the application of the racial equity framework, and how do we, really continue to both, on our side, right, from a facilitation and DLCD kind of agency perspective, try to prompt you through the framework lens, but also I guess trying to push you all to be even more ambitious, right, in your application. And so we've introduced this at every meeting, and really kind of as you go back and you think about the community relationship, when you think about some of the pillars of that framework around history and benefits and burdens, and the way we use data and engagement, accountability, restorative justice, et cetera, right, that you all are also trying to filter through and apply that as you respond to the question. So we'll continue to try to get better. I'm going to ask you all to continue to push into that direction, so we can really, achieve the outcomes that I think this entire process set forward at the beginning. So, Anita, anything to add on the challenge to folks?
No, thank you for framing that. I just want to kind of encourage, especially the folks, some of the advocates and questions about buildable lands and kind of local action and that piece. So hopefully some more discussion on what does that mean on how do we engage in, especially the BLI seems to be like the foundation of, where housing gets built besides the production. So to continue that as part of the racial equity framework discussion. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you. Before we go, Ethan, I'll pass it to you for any final words, and then we'll close this up.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to also highlight the opportunity if a rack buddy doesn't seem quite right for you, but you just have clarifying questions on any of the materials. I just also wanted to highlight the kind of open office hours that we also host previous to any rulemaking advisory committee. So those details will be provided in the email that you get with all the packet materials going forward. So just know that opportunity is also present for any rulemaking advisory committee member, whether you have a rack buddy or not. We're always happy to answer clarifying questions in that space as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Ethan. Good reminder. Take advantage, please, folks. Our next meeting will be May 7th, 9 to 12. Do the survey. Enjoy. It looks Like there's some blue sky out my window. I hope folks have a wonderful rest of the day. It's great to be back in space with you. We'll see you in May. Take care.
Thanks all.